The wind howled in gusts, like invisible blades slicing through the air, seeping through the cracks of the old wooden door in the tiny cabin. Mara sat huddled by the fireplace, the faint, flickering flames struggling to push back the biting cold of the harsh winter. The small town nestled among snow-covered hills was now completely cut off by the sudden blizzard. The power had gone out earlier in the evening, and the phone signal had vanished as if the entire outside world had been swallowed by the milky darkness. All that remained was the wind's relentless wailing and the crackling of the burning logs. Mara, 26 years old, pulled the worn-out blanket higher over her shoulders, her hands trembling. She couldn't tell if it was from the cold or the loneliness that had taken root inside her for months. This cabin was the only inheritance her mother had left behind, a place that used to be filled with laughter, the smell of freshly baked cookies, and stories told by the fire. But now it was only an empty shell, as hollow as her life since the town library had closed. Her job as a librarian, meagerly paid though it was, had once been her small joy, a place where she could lose herself in books and the familiar faces of children during story hour. Now all she had left were long, empty days, surviving on what little savings remained and gradually selling off her belongings. She looked around the room. The firelight danced across the faded wooden walls, illuminating the old armchair where her mother used to sit, and the small dining table now set for just one. Every corner of the house stirred memories, but they weren't enough to warm her heart on this stormy night. Mara sighed, her breath turning into a wisp of white that dissolved in the freezing air. She told herself that if she could just make it through this night, maybe tomorrow the sun would return, bringing a shred of hope. Suddenly a knock sounded at the door, forceful and insistent, cutting through her thoughts. Mara flinched, her heart thudding wildly. Who would be outside in weather like this? She clenched her hands, her fingernails digging into her palms as if to steady herself. The town was small, but not everyone could be trusted. Stories about drifters, people who preyed on others' kindness, flashed through her mind. The knocking came again, even more urgent this time, followed by a hoarse, desperate male voice. "Please, open the door! We need help!" Mara sprang to her feet, the blanket falling to the floor. She stepped closer to the door, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. Her heart wavered between caution and the last traces of conscience. No one knew she lived here alone, but what if the person outside truly needed help? She picked up the firewood stick by the hearth, gripping it like a shield, and slowly approached the door. Peeking through the small gap in the curtain, she could only make out a blurry silhouette in the swirling white. The knocking came again, weaker now, as if whoever was out there was losing strength. "Who's there?" Mara shouted, her voice trembling, though she tried to sound firm. "Please. My son and we're trapped in the storm. He's sick." The man's voice cracked, carrying all the weight of desperation. Mara bit her lip, her heart pounding. She didn't want to open the door, but the image of a sick child in the blizzard made it impossible to turn away. With a shaking hand, she slid the bolt open, but kept the firewood stick in her grip, ready for anything. The door swung open, and a freezing gust blasted in, carrying swirling flakes. Standing before her was a tall man, his coat caked in snow, cradling a small boy whose face was flushed with fever, his eyes shut tight. "Thank you. Thank you," the man murmured, his voice rough. He stepped inside, nearly collapsing as the wind shoved him from behind. Mara quickly closed the door, but stayed back, still gripping the stick tightly. The man she guessed he was in his 30s had a weary face, a trace of stubble, and deep blue eyes clouded with worry. The boy in his arms, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, whimpered softly, his lips tinged purple. "What's wrong with him?" Mara asked, her voice cold even as her heart softened at the sight of the child. "Noah, he has a high fever. We got stuck on the road, and then the car died in the storm. Your cabin was the only place with a light on," the man said, his voice breaking. He laid the boy down near the fireplace and took off his coat to cover his son. "I'm Alex, and this is Noah, my son." Mara nodded but didn't take her eyes off them. She couldn't be sure she could trust this man. He seemed kind, but the way he glanced around the room as if assessing something made her uneasy. She set the stick down but kept it within reach. "I'll get a blanket," she said evenly, then walked into the other room. When she came back with a thick wool blanket, she saw Alex kneeling by Noah, gently rubbing the boy's hands to warm them. The sight made her pause. A father caring for his son, maybe he wasn't a threat, but she still reminded herself to be careful. "He needs to be warmed up right away," Mara said, wrapping the blanket around Noah. She touched the boy's forehead. It was burning hot. "Do you have any medicine for him?" Alex shook his head, his eyes reflecting helplessness. "I didn't bring any. Everything is still in the car, but there's no way to get back to it now." Mara sighed and turned to rummage in the kitchen cabinet. She didn't have much, but luckily there was still some fever medicine left over from when she'd been sick last year. She measured out a small dose, mixed it with water, and handed it to Alex. He looked at her, his eyes showing gratitude mixed with faint surprise. "Thank you." He paused as if waiting for her to give her name. "Mara," she replied curtly, not wanting to share more. She sat down in a chair a short distance away, watching them. Alex gently coaxed Noah to drink the medicine, whispering soothing words. The boy gradually drifted into sleep, his breathing more even but still weak. Mara felt a swell of emotion, pity mingled with fear. She had opened her door to two strangers, and now they were here in the only place she felt safe. But seeing Noah curled up under the blanket, she couldn't regret it. "Do you live here alone?" Alex asked, his voice gentle but still making Mara flinch. "That doesn't matter," she replied, her gaze sharp. "You'll stay only until the storm passes." Alex nodded, not pressing further. He pulled Noah close and sat near the fire. The flames lit his face, highlighting lines of exhaustion, but also an undeniable steadiness. Mara studied him, trying to read the true intentions behind his presence, but all she could see was a father worried for his child. The room fell into silence, filled only with the winds howling outside and the crackle of burning wood. Mara hugged herself, trying to drive out the cold not just from the weather, but from the loneliness that had clung to her for so long. The night was far from over, and she knew the door she had just opened might change everything, even if she couldn't yet tell how. You're watching Soul Stories, where every story whispers of love, healing, and hope. Let us know which city you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe and be a part of our journey. Now stay with us. The story is just beginning. The snowstorm showed no sign of stopping. The wind still howled outside, as if it wanted to swallow the entire world in a milky white void. Inside the cabin, the firelight in the hearth still flickered, but the cold seeped through the cracks in the wooden walls, as if to remind Mara she couldn't escape reality. She sat curled up in the armchair, the old wool blanket pulled up to her chin, her eyes never leaving her two uninvited guests. Noah lay curled near the fireplace, his breathing labored, his small face flushed with fever. Alex knelt beside him, one hand gently stroking his son's hair, his gaze full of worry, but also helplessness. Suddenly, Noah whimpered, his voice faint but haunting. "Mom, Mom." The boy was delirious, his small hands reaching into the air as if trying to grasp a figure long gone. Mara felt her heart clench. That tiny pained call was like a blade stabbing straight into her memories. She remembered the nights her mother lay in the hospital bed, her voice weakly calling Mara's name, her trembling hands searching for her in the dark. Without thinking further, Mara stood up and stepped over to Noah. She knelt down, took a damp cloth from the bowl of water nearby, and gently wiped the boy's forehead. His skin was burning hot under her fingers, but the way he whimpered, as though lost in a painful dream, made it impossible for her to turn away. "Shh, it's all right, Noah," Mara whispered, her voice soft, like the way she had once comforted herself on the darkest days. She picked up a dry cloth and wiped the beads of sweat from his cheeks. From somewhere deep in her mind, an old melody surfaced, the lullaby her mother used to sing to her when she was little, when winter storms had terrified her into curling up under the blankets. Mara began to hum, her voice low but clear, like a tiny light breaking through the darkness. "Sleep tight now. The wind will stop blowing. The moon will hold you close." Alex looked up, his deep blue eyes glinting with surprise and something harder to name. He watched Mara in silence, as if for the first time truly seeing her, not just a wary stranger clutching a firewood stick, but a young woman with a tender heart, willing to kneel down and care for a child she didn't know. He swallowed hard, trying to push back the tightness rising in his chest. How long had it been since Noah was cared for like this? How long since anyone had shown his son this kind of gentle kindness? Ever since Emily, his wife, had passed, his and Noah's world had become nothing but long, empty days, where love seemed stolen by illness and loss. "You don't have to do this," Alex said, his voice hoarse, as if he were trying to hide how much it affected him. "I mean, you've already done more than enough." Mara didn't answer right away. She kept wiping Noah's forehead, her hand gentle but careful, as if afraid to wake him. "He has a fever," she said, her tone even, though not as cold as before. "If it doesn't come down, it's dangerous. I'm just doing what needs to be done." But inside her, it wasn't only what needed to be done. There was something in Noah's dull eyes, in the way he called for his mother, that had awakened a deep part of her, a part she thought she'd buried with her own mother. She remembered the long nights her mother had struggled against illness, remembered how she still tried to smile despite the pain, and how, in her final moments, she held Mara's hand and whispered that kindness was the only thing that never faded. Mara didn't want to admit it, but caring for Noah, even just in this moment, made her feel alive again, if only a little. Alex said nothing, but his eyes never left her. Finally he spoke, his voice low and sincere. "Noah lost his mom 2 years ago. Cancer. It took her too fast. I don't know how to make it up to him." He paused, staring down at his hands as if searching for an answer, in the veins standing out across them. "Some days I feel like I'm not a good father." Mara stopped humming, her fingers stilled on Noah's forehead. Alex's confession, so unexpected and honest, made her feel a fragile connection. She knew the pain of losing someone you loved. She knew that hollow feeling, as if a part of you had been torn away and would never heal. "I lost my mother 3 years ago," she said, her voice quiet but steady, as if she were telling someone else's story. "She was all I had. After she was gone, I didn't know what I was living for anymore. This house," she looked around, her gaze passing over the old wooden walls, "was the only thing that kept me here." Alex nodded as if he understood that pain without needing any more explanation. The two of them, though strangers, were now bound by the invisible scars of loss. The room seemed a little less cold, not because the fire burned brighter, but because of the unexpected honesty slowly filling the space between them. Noah whimpered again, but this time he seemed to be sleeping deeper, his breathing steadier. Mara stood and placed another log in the hearth, the flames rising and lighting her face. Alex watched her, feeling both gratitude and guilt. He wanted to say something, but the words caught in his throat. He knew that in his bag, under his coat, were the papers that could destroy this young woman's small world. But now, seeing her care for Noah with a mother's gentleness, he couldn't bring himself to face that truth. "You sing beautifully," he said softly, as if trying to hold on to the moment a little longer. "That song, my mother used to sing it to me too." Mara smiled a small, fleeting smile, but the first she had shown all night. "My mom said that song could chase away any storm," she replied, her voice carrying a hint of longing. "I'm not sure it really works, but at least it makes me feel a little less afraid." They fell into silence again, but this time it wasn't heavy. Mara sat down, a safe distance from Alex and Noah, but close enough to feel the warmth of the fire and of their presence. Outside, the blizzard still howled, but in the small cabin, a fragile light had appeared not from the flames, but from two hearts slowly opening, if only by a sliver. Mara looked at Noah, then at Alex, and for the first time that night, she thought that maybe, just maybe, this man wasn't entirely a stranger. Pale morning light slipped through the crack in the curtain, casting faint streaks across the worn wooden floor of the cabin. The howling wind had quieted, replaced by the almost suffocating stillness of a world that had just survived a snowstorm. Mara woke with her body aching, the wool blanket slipping from her shoulders. She had dozed off in the armchair by the fireplace, only a few steps from Alex and Noah. The fire had died down, leaving only a few glowing embers, but the room no longer felt as cold as the night before. Maybe it was the dawn light, or maybe the warmth of the people sharing this small space with her. Mara rubbed her eyes and looked over at Noah. The boy still slept, his breathing steadier, his face no longer flushed with fever. The fever medicine had worked, and her lullaby, even if it was only a small comfort, seemed to have helped him through the worst of it. Alex sat propped against the wall, eyes half closed, but his posture made it clear he hadn't truly slept like a father who kept watch over his child, even in moments of exhaustion. Mara felt something almost like respect for him, though she still tried to maintain her distance. She stood and quietly stepped into the kitchen to boil water. The sound of the kettle bubbling broke the silence, rousing Alex from his daze. He opened his eyes and looked at Mara with an exhausted gaze that carried a hint of gratitude. "You're up early," he said, his voice rough from lack of sleep. "Noah, he's better. Thank you, Mara." "Really?" Mara only nodded, not replying. She wasn't used to receiving thanks, especially from a stranger. She poured the hot water into 2 mugs and added some herbal tea from her mother's old tin. A faint mint scent spread through the air, carrying memories of peaceful mornings long ago. She handed 1 mug to Alex, keeping the other in her hands, the warmth seeping into her cold fingers. "The storm is over," she said evenly, looking out the window where the last snowflakes drifted lazily down. "You and Noah can leave now." Alex nodded, but his eyes flickered with a moment of hesitation. He stood, checked on Noah again, then began gathering the few things they had brought. His snow-caked coat was dry now, neatly folded. Mara watched him, noticing the way he moved careful, almost slow, as if he were delaying something. She told herself it was only her imagination. He just wanted to leave, the same as she did. Didn't he? Noah woke as Alex gently nudged him. The boy's eyes were tired but clearer than the night before. When he saw Mara, he smiled a small, sincere smile. He sat up, pulling the wool blanket around his shoulders, then suddenly stood and walked over to hug Mara, his small arms wrapped around her waist, tighter than any sick child should have been able to manage. "Thank you, Miss Mara," Noah whispered, his young voice full of emotion. "You sang to me, didn't you? I dreamed about my mom, but I saw you too." Mara froze for a moment, unsure how to respond. Noah's hug, warm and innocent, melted the ice she'd built around her heart. She rested her hand on his head, gently smoothing his soft hair, trying to hold back the tightness rising in her throat. "It's nothing, Noah," she said softly, her voice gentle. "I'm just glad you're okay." Alex stood there watching, and for a moment, something deeper than gratitude flickered in his eyes, but he quickly looked away, masking it by packing up again. Mara felt a vague unease. There was something in the way he avoided her gaze, in the way his hand clenched, as if he were struggling with himself. "We'll be on our way," Alex said, his voice low. He slung the bag over his shoulder and helped Noah to his feet. "You've helped us more than I can ever say." Mara only nodded, wanting to end this moment. She wanted them gone so she could return to her familiar loneliness, where she didn't have to confront the complicated feelings these 2 strangers had stirred up. But as Alex led Noah to the door, he stopped, his hand resting on the doorknob. He turned back, took a small white envelope from his bag, carefully sealed. "Here," he said, hesitating, "if you need to reach me or if anything comes up. Thank you again, Mara." He placed the envelope on the dining table, then quickly ushered Noah outside. The door closed behind them, leaving Mara in the heavy silence. She looked at the envelope, feeling as if it were something foreign, something that didn't belong in her world. Outside, the sound of Alex's and Noah's footsteps faded into the fresh snow. Mara stood still, gripping the edge of the table as if to keep herself from being pulled into a whirlwind of feelings she didn't understand. At last, she stepped over and picked up the envelope. It was light as air, yet somehow unbearably heavy in her hand. With trembling fingers, she tore open the seal and pulled out a pristine, white business card, the black letters crisp and sharp. She read the line, and the world around her seemed to collapse. Alexander Reed, Senior Attorney, Harrison and Reed Law Firm, Representative of National Bank, Asset Recovery Division. Mara felt her breath stop. The business card slipped from her hand, drifting to the floor like a dead leaf. She sank down, her knees hitting the wooden boards with a hollow thud. Her heart, already full of old scars, felt as if it had been ripped open again. The man she had let through her door, the man she had shared what little kindness she had left, was the one sent to take away her only home, the cabin that held all her memories of her mother, the place she had fought to keep with every ounce of strength she had. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. Tears spilled hot over her cold cheeks. "How could this happen?" She hugged herself, as if trying to keep the pieces of her heart from falling apart. The image of Noah hugging her, Alex's gentle voice, the lullaby she had sung all of it, now felt like a cruel joke. She had let them into her life, let herself believe that kindness could bring something good. But now the harsh truth was as clear as the cold dawn outside, sharp, merciless. Mara sat there on the icy floor, her eyes locked on the lone business card. She didn't know what she would do next, but deep inside a small flame began to burn, not the warmth of kindness, but the resolve to protect what was hers no matter the cost. Mara stood before the weathered wooden door of the cabin, her gaze blazing with fury as she stared at the business card on the dining table. Alexander Reed, senior attorney. The crisp, sharp letters cut into her heart like blades. She had opened her door to him, cared for his little boy, let herself believe there was some fragile connection between them. But now the harsh truth was laid bare. He was the one hired to take her cabin, the place that held every memory of her mother, the place she had clung to just to survive her losses. Rage flared inside her like a fire, burning away the last scraps of trust she had left. She had been betrayed, and it hurt more than the cold of the storm last night. She clenched her hands, her nails digging into her palms, but the pain couldn't soothe the storm of emotion raging in her chest. "I'm such a fool," she whispered, her voice shaking with humiliation and anger. But Mara wasn't someone who gave up easily. This cabin was her mother's legacy, those nights of stories by the fire, the place where she had once felt loved. She wouldn't let it be taken from her, especially not by someone like Alex, a wealthy man living in a world of power and money, where people like her were nothing but numbers on a ledger. Mara grabbed her coat, stuffed the business card into her pocket like a reminder of her enemy, and stepped outside, her boots sinking into the snow, still blanketing the ground after the storm. The small town was slowly coming back to life, with snow plows rumbling past and neighbors shoveling walkways. But Mara didn't pay any attention. She walked straight to the bank, the place that held her cabin's fate. The cold wind whipped against her, but it was nothing compared to the chill inside her. At the bank, the small room with its white walls and the smell of stale paper felt suffocating. The clerk, a middle-aged man in thick glasses, looked at her with detached indifference. "Miss Mara, I'm very sorry, but your mother's loan has been overdue for too long," he said in a flat voice, eyes skimming the stack of papers. "The bank can't grant any more extensions. Repossession is mandatory." "Please," Mara interrupted, her voice trembling but firm. "This is my home. I just need more time. I'll find a way to pay." The clerk sighed and pushed his glasses up. "The decision's already been approved. Our law firm, Harrison and Reed, is handling it. You should prepare to vacate." Mara felt the blood rush to her face. She wanted to scream, but instead she fixed him with a cold, steady glare. "Alexander Reed," she nearly spat the name. "He's the one behind this, isn't he?" "I don't have that information," the clerk replied blandly. "You can contact the law firm, but honestly, Miss Mara, no one is going to change this." Mara left the bank, her hands shaking with anger and desperation. The clerk's words felt like a sentence, and Alexander Reed's name was a blade twisting deeper into her wound. A rich lawyer, driving luxury cars, wearing expensive coats, but who'd let his son shiver through a freezing storm just to come here and carry out the job of taking her home. She clenched the business card in her pocket, feeling as if it were burning her hand. Meanwhile, in the city, Alex sat in his sleek office at Harrison and Reed on the upper floor of a skyscraper. The spacious room, with its vast windows overlooking the city skyline, was bright with the cold morning light, but none of it eased the heaviness in his chest. In front of him lay the stack of documents about Mara's cabin, next to an untouched cup of expensive coffee. He couldn't focus. The image of Mara kneeling beside Noah, wiping his forehead with a mother's tenderness, haunted him. She had saved his son, had opened her door in the middle of a storm, even though she had no reason to trust a stranger like him, a wealthy man, from a world far removed from her struggles. Alex rubbed his forehead, his guilt gnawing at him. As a senior attorney, he was used to deals like this, cold transactions, where people were nothing but figures in a contract. His wealth, luxury apartments, the high-end car, the comfortable bank accounts was the result of years of relentless work in the ruthless legal world. But this time, everything felt different. Mara wasn't just a name on a page. She was the woman who had given him and Noah shelter, who had shared a little warmth and kindness in a storm. And now he was the one about to destroy her small world. He looked at the photo on his desk, Emily and Noah, their smiles bright on a long-ago summer day. What would Emily think of him now? A successful, wealthy husband who was about to take the home of a girl who had already lost everything? He clenched his fists, trying to shove away the guilt that wouldn't let go. This is just business, he told himself. He didn't have a choice. He had Noah to take care of, a firm to maintain, and a reputation to protect. But that thought wasn't enough to quiet the regret inside him. He wanted to call Mara, to explain that he hadn't meant to hurt her, that last night he had only been a desperate father. But he knew those words would change nothing. Mara returned to the cabin, her legs heavy as lead. She slammed the door shut, the sound echoing through the quiet space. She threw the business card onto the table, staring at it like it was an enemy. The anger still burned in her chest, but underneath it was the raw pain of betrayal. She had believed her kindness meant something, that the moments by the fire last night were a rare flicker of hope in her life. But Alex, with all his wealth and power, had turned it into a cruel joke. She sat down, hugging her knees, her eyes drifting over the room. The worn-out armchair, the bookshelf filled with old storybooks, the fireplace where she had warmed Noah, everything here was her mother, everything she had left. She couldn't lose this place. She couldn't lose another piece of herself. Mara wiped her tears away, stood up, and clenched the business card in her hand. She wouldn't let that rich lawyer win. This was her fight now, and she would battle with every ounce of pride and strength she still had. Mara walked along the road dusted with a thin layer of snow, her breath turning into pale clouds in the frigid evening air. The bag on her shoulder was heavy with small goods she delivered to the grocery store in town to scrape together a few extra dollars. Since that futile trip to the bank, Mara had decided she wouldn't sit still and wait for fate. The cabin, her mother's last legacy, would not be stolen easily, not by the bank, and certainly not by Alexander Reed, the wealthy lawyer with his false, polished gaze and well-crafted lies. She would fight, even if it meant working herself to exhaustion or selling her most precious keepsakes. She had started selling off her belongings, her mother's antique clock, a few rare books from the shelf, even the silver bracelet her mother used to wear. Each item that left the cabin felt like another cut into her heart, but Mara gritted her teeth and bore it. She told herself that as long as she could keep the house, every sacrifice was worth it. By day, she worked as a waitress in a small cafe. At night, she made deliveries all over town, ignoring the cold and the slick, dangerous roads. Exhaustion clung to her like a shadow, but her pride and her anger at Alex kept her on her feet. She would not let that man, wrapped in his life of luxury, see her fall. Tonight, Mara picked up a late order, a bag of groceries to be delivered to a residential area on the edge of town. The clock was nearing 10, and the cold seeped through her thin coat, making her shiver in waves. As soon as she dropped off the delivery, her phone buzzed with a message from her manager, an urgent order to be brought to the town hospital. Mara sighed but didn't refuse. Every dollar she earned was one more chance to keep the cabin a little longer. She climbed onto her old bicycle and pedaled quickly down the empty streets, the dim street lights reflecting off the glittering snow. The town hospital rose out of the darkness, light from the glass doors spilling onto the pavement like a small beacon in the night. Mara stepped into the main lobby, the delivery bag in hand, ready to leave it at the front desk when a familiar sound made her freeze. A child's hacking, broken cough echoed from the corner of the lobby. She turned her head and her heart seemed to stop when she saw Alex still looking immaculate in his expensive wool coat holding Noah in his arms. The boy was coughing violently, his face flushed red, eyes shut tight, looking even weaker than he had that night in the blizzard. Mara felt the blood rush to her head. She wanted to turn and walk out, to leave them to their cold, privileged world. Alex, the man who had deceived her, who had used her kindness only to prepare to take her home, deserved none of her concern. But when her eyes fell on Noah, her heart betrayed her. The small boy, trembling in his father's arms, looked like a lost fledgling. His cough, fragile but full of pain, was an unspoken plea that pulled her closer. Mara bit her lip, her hands tightening around the straps of the delivery bag. She told herself she could just set the bag down and leave. But her feet moved on their own, slowly, as if led by some invisible force. Alex looked up, surprise flickering across his face when he recognized her. He looked tired, his brown hair slightly disheveled, his deep blue eyes filled with worry and something like confusion. "Mara?" he called, his voice rough, as if he couldn't believe she was really standing there. She didn't answer. She set the bag down on the floor, stepped closer, and silently reached out to take Noah from his arms. The boy was feather-light, his body burning with fever, and his coughing wrenched at her heart. Mara held Noah tighter, letting his head rest on her shoulder, one hand gently patting his back, just as she had on the stormy night. "You don't have to do this," Alex said, his voice low but thick with emotion. I'll call a nurse." "Fine," Mara cut him off, her voice sharp but shaking. "Get some water, too. I'll stay with him." Alex hesitated, but his eyes softened when he saw how she held Noah. He nodded and hurried toward the reception desk. Mara sat down on one of the lobby chairs, Noah still in her arms. She pulled a handkerchief from her pocket, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and whispered, "It's all right, Noah. I'm here." The boy gave a faint groan, his eyelids fluttering open, and he looked at her with a glimmer of recognition. "Miss Mara," he whispered, his voice frail but warm. "I knew you'd come." The words stabbed into Mara's heart like a blade. She wanted to be angry, to hold on to the rage she felt toward Alex, but Noah, the innocent boy with his clear eyes, made it impossible. Her emotions churned inside her like a fresh storm, fury at Alex for his betrayal, pity for Noah, and a fierce longing, though she didn't want to admit it, to believe that the night in the blizzard hadn't been all a lie. Was Alex truly just a desperate father? Or had it all been a performance by a wealthy lawyer to get what he wanted? Alex returned with a cup of water and a blanket from the nurse. He knelt beside Mara, carefully draping the blanket over Noah. He looked at her, his eyes filled with regret. "Mara, I don't know what to say. Thank you again. Noah, he really cares about you." "Don't say anything," Mara cut him off, her voice cold though her eyes wavered. "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for Noah." Alex nodded, his lips pressing into a tight line, as if he were holding something back. He sat down in the chair next to her, keeping just enough distance not to crowd her. The hospital lobby was quiet, broken only by Noah's ragged cough and the soft hum of the ventilation. Mara held the boy tighter, feeling the heat of his small body. She looked at Alex, the man with the life of privilege she would never touch, and wondered if he truly understood what she was fighting to protect, not just the cabin, but her heart itself, which had once opened in kindness and was now closing again in betrayal. But when Noah curled against her, whispering, "Miss Mara, don't go," she felt a tiny light flicker in the darkness inside her. She didn't want to trust Alex, didn't want to forgive, but for Noah, she couldn't walk away. She sat there caught between anger and compassion, not knowing that this moment would change everything, not just for her, but for the man quietly watching her, with eyes full of guilt and hope. Still following the story? If this story found you outside of Soul Stories, we invite you home to where every touching tale begins with truth, hope, and heart. The hospital lobby lay in the stillness of the late night, broken only by the soft hum of the air vents and Noah's occasional weak cough. Mara sat on a hard plastic chair, the boy cradled in her lap, his breathing gradually evening out as sleep pulled him into a temporary peace. The cold fluorescent light shone down on Noah's pale face, highlighting the damp brown curls stuck to his forehead. Mara gently wiped it with her handkerchief, her movements so careful it was as if she were afraid of breaking something fragile. She tried to focus only on Noah, on his innocence, to avoid facing the man sitting beside her, Alex, the man she'd wished only hours ago she could erase from her memory. Alex sat one seat away, his hands clasped tightly, his eyes fixed on the floor tiles as though he were searching for answers in the cold, dull pattern. In this moment, he no longer looked like a prestigious attorney. He was just a father, exhausted and worried, the lines around his eyes carved deep by sleepless nights. Mara could feel his gaze flicker toward her now and then, but she didn't look back. She didn't want to talk, didn't want to hear any explanations. Yet the longer their silence stretched, the heavier it became, as though both of them knew there were things that needed to be spoken. Finally, Alex drew in a deep breath, his hoarse voice breaking the stillness. "Mara, I need to tell you something," he began, his voice low but filled with a quiet resolve, as if he'd struggled a long time to find these words. Mara didn't lift her head, her hand still stroking Noah's back. "I don't want to hear it," she answered coldly, but her heart thumped hard in her chest, as if waiting for something she didn't want to admit. "I know you hate me. You have every right," Alex continued, his voice trembling slightly. "But please, just listen. Not for me, but for everything that's happened." Mara bit her lip, her gaze still locked on Noah. She didn't want to look at Alex, didn't want to see an expression that might weaken her. But the sincerity in his voice, no matter how she tried to shut it out, slipped into her thoughts. She didn't reply, but she didn't stop him either. That was the only sign Alex needed. "That night, when Noah and I came to your cabin, I didn't plan it," he said slowly, choosing every word. "We were stranded on the road in the storm. The car died, and Noah, he was nearly unconscious from the fever. I'd been driving for hours trying to find shelter. Your cabin was the only place with a light in that blinding snow. I didn't know who you were. I didn't know it was—" He paused, swallowing hard. "The house I'd been hired to repossess." Mara felt a surge of anger rise, but she held it back, her hand clutching the edge of the blanket draped over Noah. "And you think that changes anything?" she asked, her voice sharp as ice. "You still showed up at my door as the man hired to take my home. You still let me care for your son." Alex bowed his head, his hands tightening even more, as though trying to keep his guilt from spilling over. "I know," he whispered, "and I have no excuse. I never wanted to hurt you, Mara, but I'm bound by the contract. My firm, Harrison and Reed, took this case from the bank. I'm only one part of that machine." "A rich machine," Mara cut in, her eyes finally meeting his, as sharp as a blade. "You live in luxury apartments, drive expensive cars, and now you destroy the lives of people like me for a contract. Did you ever think about what it feels like for us?" Alex's brow furrowed, pain flashing in his eyes. "You think I don't understand," he said, his voice low but thick with feeling. "I lost my wife to illness, Mara. Yes, I have money, but money didn't save her. Money doesn't make Noah happy when he calls for his mother in his dreams. I do this because I have to take care of my son, because I have to keep his life stable." His words struck Mara like a blow, but she refused to soften, not now, when everything she loved was under threat. "If you really cared about Noah, you wouldn't have let him end up in that storm," she said, her voice shaking with anger and pain. "You have everything: money, power, and still, you chose this. You chose to destroy my home." Alex fell silent for a long moment, his gaze dropping to the floor as if he were fighting with himself. Finally, he looked up, his voice softer, almost a whisper. "There's something you need to know, Mara. This contract, it didn't only come from the bank. There's a private client behind it, someone who specifically requested the repossession of your cabin." Mara frowned, a chill of unease spreading through her. "Who?" she asked, her voice taut. Alex drew in a deep breath, as though bracing for impact. "It's your uncle, Edward Langley. He wants the land to build a resort. My firm only took the contract through the bank on his behalf." The world seemed to stop around Mara. Edward Langley, her own uncle, whom she'd barely spoken to in years, the man who'd always treated her and her mother like burdens. She remembered the visits, his cold eyes as he looked around the cabin, the way he would hint that this land is worth much more than an old shack. But she'd never imagined he would go this far, that he would betray his own family for profit. "My uncle," Mara whispered, her voice breaking. She clutched Noah tighter, as though he were the only thing keeping her from falling apart. Tears welled in her eyes, but she bit her lip, refusing to let them fall. Not here, not in front of Alex. "I'm sorry, Mara," Alex said, his voice raw with remorse. "I didn't know he was your uncle when I took the case. If I'd known—" He trailed off, knowing any words were useless now. Mara didn't answer. She looked down at Noah, still sleeping in her arms, unaware of the secrets tearing her apart inside. Alex's betrayal hurt, but her family's betrayal was even more brutal. She felt like an animal cornered, with nowhere left to run. "You're lying. You're bringing up my uncle to justify yourself, aren't you?" "If it's true, I won't let him win," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding, like a vow. "And I won't let you win either." Alex nodded, his expression full of pain, but also edged with something resolute. "I'll try to find a way, Mara. I can't promise anything, but I owe you that much." Mara didn't respond. She only held Noah tighter, feeling the warmth of his small body as a reminder that, no matter how cruel the world became, she still had something worth fighting for. Tonight the secrets had come to light, but her battle had only just begun. The hospital lobby slowly sank into the quiet of the late night, broken only by the low hum of the air vents and the steady breathing of Noah sleeping in Mara's lap. The cold fluorescent light fell across her face, highlighting the tension in her features and the redness in her eyes, despite how hard she tried to hide the tears she couldn't hold back. Alex's confession about her uncle Edward Langley still echoed in her mind, like a blade cutting deeper into an already bleeding wound. Not only Alex had betrayed her, but her own family, the uncle her mother once trusted, had turned against her, plotting to steal the cabin and turn it into a luxury resort. Mara felt like the entire world was collapsing, leaving her alone amid the wreckage. She held Noah tighter, as if the boy's warmth was the only thing keeping her from drifting into the endless emptiness of her pain. Alex sat beside her, a careful distance away, his gaze full of remorse but unable to meet hers. He knew he'd hurt her, even if it hadn't been intentional. His wealth, his power, his position as senior attorney, all the things that had once been his pride, now only made him feel powerless in the face of Mara's anguish. "Mara, Alex began, his voice low and hesitant. "I want to help you. I can go over the paperwork again, see if there's any way to delay the foreclosure. Maybe there's a legal loophole, or at the very least I can buy you more time to prepare." Mara lifted her head, her gaze icy even as a storm of conflicting feelings churned beneath it. "Help me," she repeated bitterly. "You're the one behind all this, Alex. You and your fancy law firm. And now you expect me to believe you'd turn your back on them, on the money, on everything you have, just to help me?" Alex dropped his head, his hands clenching in his lap as if he were fighting to keep the ache inside. "I know you don't trust me," he said hoarsely, "and I don't blame you. But that night, when you opened your door to me and Noah, when you cared for my son, that wasn't part of any contract. That was real. I don't want you to lose your home, Mara. I'll do everything I can to make this right." His words, sincere and full of guilt, made Mara waver, though she didn't want to admit it. Alex, this man from a world of privilege, who could have walked out of her life without ever looking back, did he deserve even the smallest measure of her trust? "I don't need your pity," Mara said, her voice trembling but firm. "I've survived on my own this long. I'll find a way to keep the cabin, with or without you." Alex nodded, and something in his eyes flickered between respect and sorrow. "I understand, but let me try, Mara. Not out of pity, because I owe you, because of Noah, and because of me." Mara didn't answer. She stood, carefully shifting Noah into Alex's arms. The boy stirred and whimpered but didn't wake, his head dropping onto his father's shoulder. Without another word, Mara turned, picked up her delivery bag, set it on the reception desk, and walked out of the hospital without looking back. The cold night air slapped her face, but it couldn't compare to the cold inside her. Her uncle's betrayal, Alex's deception, it all felt like blades cutting her from every side. She wanted to fight alone, the way she always had, but the thought of accepting Alex's help made her uncertain. Could she ever trust him, or was this just another trap? Mara returned to the cabin when the clock was striking 2 in the morning. The house was dark, lit only by a thin spill of moonlight through the window. She didn't turn on the lamp. She simply sat in the armchair, hugging her knees, letting the darkness swallow her. Memories of her mother washed over her mother's words about trust, about giving people a chance, even when the world was cruel. But her mother had never faced someone like Edward Langley, or someone like Alex, who was both an unwitting savior and the man threatening to destroy everything. If she refused Alex's help, did she really have the strength to fight her uncle and the bank alone? But if she accepted, was she putting herself in the hands of the very man who had betrayed her, the enemy who had come to take her home? Mara sat there the rest of the night, wrestling with herself. When the first dawn broke, pale but unyielding, she stood. She picked up Alex's business card from the dining table and looked at it again. She didn't know if she was making the right choice, but she knew she couldn't let Edward Langley win. And if Alex truly wanted to make amends, she would give him a chance not for him, but for herself and for the cabin she had sworn to protect. She typed a short message to the number on the card. "I agree. Help me find a way to delay the foreclosure. Don't make me regret this." The next morning, Mara stood by the cabin window, watching the snow sparkle in the pale sunlight. She heard a car pull up in front of the house, and her heart beat faster when she saw Alex step out of a sleek black SUV, a symbol of the life of privilege she'd never touch. Noah sat in the back seat, waving at her through the glass, a bright smile on his still pale face. Mara opened the door, her eyes steady but no longer as cold as before. Alex walked in, a folder of documents in hand, his expression serious but threaded with a glimmer of hope. Noah scrambled out, running to her and hugging her before she could react. "Miss Mara," he cried, his voice full of innocence, "I wish you were my mom. Dad says you're the best person in the world." Mara froze, her heart twisting at his guileless words. She looked up at Alex and saw him giving her an embarrassed, helpless smile, as if he didn't know what to say to his son's blunt honesty. She knelt, hugging Noah, feeling his warmth like a reminder that, no matter how hard the fight ahead, she wasn't completely alone anymore. "And you're the most wonderful boy, Noah," she whispered, her voice breaking. Then she stood facing Alex. "Where do we start?" Alex nodded, determination in his eyes. "With the paperwork. I'll go through everything. If there's a way to delay this, I'll find it." Mara nodded too, her heart still heavy, but with a tiny spark of light flickering to life. She didn't know if she could trust Alex completely, but for the cabin and for herself, she was willing to take the risk one more time. The pale midday sunlight streamed through the cabin window, falling across the stacks of old papers that Mara and Alex had spread out over the dining table. These documents, her mother's legacy, were a mess of bills, letters, and handwritten notes on yellowing sheets. Mara sat on one side of the table, her hands turning each page with a mix of care and dread. Across from her, Alex's eyes were fixed intently on the files in front of him. Noah played in the corner, building towers out of the old wooden blocks Mara had found in storage, his innocent laughter the only sound breaking the tension between the two adults. Mara still wasn't completely comfortable with Alex's presence. Deciding to let him help her find a way to keep the cabin had been a difficult choice, but she seemed to have no other option. Every time she looked at him, she felt a little flicker of doubt. "This is the loan agreement your mother signed with the bank," Alex said quietly, sliding a document toward her. "But I don't think the problem is here. If your uncle, Edward Langley, is behind this, there could be an error in the ownership transfer process. We need to find proof that the cabin legally belongs to you." Mara nodded, but her gaze stayed wary. "My mother used to say she left a will," she said, her voice low but steady. "But I never saw it. After she died, I didn't have time to look. Everything happened so fast." Alex looked at her, sympathy flickering in his eyes. "We'll find it," If it exists, it could be the key to stopping the foreclosure. They started going through the old boxes Mara had pulled down from the attic, the things she'd avoided touching since her mother died, because every piece of paper carried a memory she wasn't sure she could face. The smell of dust and old paper filled the room, mingling with the scent of burning wood from the fireplace Mara had just lit. She opened a file box, her hands trembling when she recognized her mother's neat, slanting handwriting on a yellowed envelope. She stopped, drew a deep breath, and tried to keep the ache in her chest from overwhelming her. Alex noticed the change on her face. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, his voice careful not to push. Mara nodded without looking up. "I'm just not used to sorting through all this. Every piece feels like part of her." He was silent for a moment before his voice grew softer. "I understand. When Emily died, I couldn't touch any of her things for months. Every object felt like a reminder that she was gone forever." Mara lifted her head, meeting his eyes for the first time. This time she didn't look away. "How did you get past it?" she asked quietly, almost in a whisper. Alex gave a sad smile, his gaze drifting to the window where snowflakes hung in the air. "I'm not sure I have. Some days I just try to keep going for Noah. But sometimes I feel like she's still here somewhere, reminding me not to give up." He paused, looking at her. "You remind me of her, Mara, the way you cared for Noah, the way you don't quit even when everything is against you." His words caught her off guard. She wanted to reject them, to hold on to the wall of pride between them, but there was something in his honest voice that made her hesitate. She turned back to the pile of papers, trying to hide the emotions welling up inside her. They kept working in silence, but the air between them had changed, not so much cold distrust anymore, but a fragile understanding. After hours of searching, Mara opened an old envelope. Inside was a handwritten document, her mother's writing clear and deliberate. Her heart hammered as she read the first line. "The will of Anna Langley." She handed the paper to Alex, her hands shaking. This is the will," she said, her voice breaking. "My mother left the cabin to me, but it was never notarized." Alex skimmed it quickly, a glimmer of hope lighting his eyes. "If this is the original, and we can prove your mother's signature, it might be enough to challenge the foreclosure. But we'll need more supporting documents, anything related to the property's ownership." Mara nodded, feeling as if a tiny light had pierced the darkness. They dug deeper into the boxes, working together with a renewed focus. As the afternoon light began to fade, Noah ran over and tugged on Mara's hand, his face glowing with excitement. "Miss Mara, Dad says we're close to saving your house," he cheered, his eyes shining. "You're going to stay here forever, right?" Mara smiled, brushing the hair back from his forehead. "I hope so, Noah," she said softly. She looked over at Alex, and for the first time, she didn't see just a wealthy lawyer. She saw a father, a man who had lost too much, and who was now trying to make amends. When Noah went back to his blocks, Alex spoke, his voice low but sincere. "Mara, I know you don't trust me, and I don't blame you, but I want you to know I'm not doing this out of obligation. I'm doing it for you and Noah, and because I want to believe I can still do something right." Mara met his eyes, her gaze softer, though still edged with caution. "I don't fully trust you, Alex," she said frankly. "But if you really mean to help, prove it." Alex nodded, determination bright in his expression. They kept working into the evening, sharing the small space of the cabin in an uneasy partnership. Mara began to realize that, much as she resisted admitting it, she was starting to trust him not because he was a lawyer or wealthy, but because of the glimpses he had shown her. The raw grief when he spoke of his wife, the way he was devoted to Noah, and the quiet resolve in his eyes when he promised to help her. When the moon began to shine through the window, Mara looked down at the stack of papers on the table, her mother's will lying in the center. She felt a small but steady flame of hope, like the fire in the hearth that night of the blizzard. She was no longer alone. Even if Alex had once been the enemy, now he was her ally, an unlikely ally. But maybe, just maybe, someone she could learn to lean on. The wind began to howl harder, carrying swirling snow past the cabin windows. Another blizzard was sweeping in, sudden and fierce. no less threatening than the night Mara had first opened her door to Alex and Noah. The small town was once again swallowed in a white haze, as if nature itself meant to test them one more time. Mara stood by the window, hands wrapped around a mug of hot tea, her eyes drifting over the snow-covered hills. Inside her, another storm churned, the anxious wait for the court's decision about her mother's will. That document, even though it had never been notarized, was her last hope of keeping the cabin from her greedy uncle and the bank. But waiting for Mara felt like slow torture, every minute stretching her uncertainty further. That afternoon, Alex and Noah had stopped by to pick up the last of the documents. The blizzard struck before they could leave, and they decided to stay. Mara went into the kitchen, pulling out a few potatoes, some carrots, and the last can of bean soup in the cupboard. "It's nothing fancy," she said, her voice a little self-conscious when she caught Alex's gaze. "But it's enough to warm us up." "Let me help," Alex replied, standing and stepping beside her. He picked up a knife and began slicing potatoes with the clumsy effort of someone who had never spent much time in a kitchen. Mara raised an eyebrow but didn't stop him. Instead, she handed Noah a wooden spoon to stir the soup, and he set to it enthusiastically, chattering about the blocks he'd built into a castle in the corner. The small kitchen soon filled with warm sounds, the thump of the knife against the cutting board, Noah's giggles, the crackle of the fire in the stove. Mara felt an odd sensation, as though the cabin hadn't felt this alive since her mother had passed away. She looked at Alex, saw him smiling when Noah accidentally spilled some soup on the table, and her heart unexpectedly beat faster. He was no longer the wealthy lawyer in a suit or the man behind the threat to her home. He was just Alex, a clumsy father trying to do the right thing. They sat around the table, each with a steaming bowl of soup, the rising steam carrying a simple, comforting aroma. Noah ate eagerly, talking between bites about a snow dog he'd seen on the road. Alex laughed, adding the story of the time he'd tried to ski and tumbled headfirst in front of Noah, making the boy laugh until he cried. Mara, who had planned to stay quiet, found herself laughing too when Noah mimicked his father's clumsy fall. Their laughter blended together as if, for a moment, they were a real family. When Noah ran back to his corner to play, Mara and Alex stayed at the table, their tea growing cold in their hands. The air between them had softened, but it still carried the tension of unspoken things. Mara looked at him, her gaze gentler now, though still tinged with caution. "Thank you for helping with the documents," she said quietly. "I didn't think I'd ever let you stay here again, after everything that happened." Alex gave a sad smile, his eyes dropping to the table. "I don't blame you. I put you in this position, even if I didn't mean to. But Mara, I want you to know I'm doing everything I can to make it right." She nodded, not answering right away. Noah suddenly bounded over, squeezing between them, his eyes bright. He climbed onto Mara's lap, resting his head on her shoulder and whispering, "Miss Mara, I've never seen Dad laugh so much. Since Mom left, he's always been sad. But today, he's really happy." Mara felt her heart squeeze. She looked at Alex and saw him bow his head, hiding a shy, emotional smile. Noah's words, innocent and honest, were like a mirror reflecting something she'd already begun to feel. She looked at Alex and saw not only a father, but a man who had lost too much, just as she had. In that moment, she realized something in her heart had shifted. She no longer saw him only as a rich lawyer or a betrayer. She saw him as a companion, however unlikely in her fight. "Noah, you're making me embarrassed," Mara said gently, brushing the boy's hair from his forehead. She glanced at Alex, and for the first time, she smiled at him, a real smile, unforced. Alex returned her look with a warm gaze, as if they had both just stepped across an invisible line. The blizzard still roared outside, but inside the cabin, the firelight and Noah's laughter made a fragile shelter. Mara didn't know what the court's decision would be, but in that moment, she felt she was no longer alone. She looked at Alex and Noah, and in her heart, a small, stubborn hope began to flicker, not just for the cabin, but for whatever might come after the storm. The small-town courtroom felt cramped and stifling, even with the windows thrown wide open to let in a little of the winter chill. Mara sat in the front row, her hands clenched tight in her lap, her nails digging into her palms as if to steady the trembling she couldn't control. Her gaze was locked on the judge's bench, where the papers related to her mother's will, her last hope of keeping the cabin, were being reviewed. Opposite her sat the bank representative and Edward Langley, the uncle she had once called Uncle Ed as a little girl. He sat ramrod straight, dressed in an expensive gray suit, his hair neatly combed, looking every inch the successful businessman. But his cold eyes made Mara shiver. She remembered the rare visits he'd paid her mother, always laced with hints about selling the cabin to realize the land's value. Now his true face was exposed. A greedy man willing to betray his own family to turn her home into a luxury resort. Beside him sat Alex, dressed in a tailored black suit, his expression taut with tension. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a stern face, struck her gavel to call the session to order. The bank's representative spoke first, arguing that Mara's mother's loan had long since gone unpaid, and that ownership of the cabin therefore belonged to the bank by contract. Mara felt her heart constrict. She glanced at Alex, who was leafing quickly through the documents, his gaze sharp but composed. He had spent countless nights poring over the will with her, searching for any flaw in the bank's paperwork, but the fact that he had once been part of the machine, Harrison and Reed, still made it impossible for her to fully relax. Then Edward took the stand. His voice was smooth and confident, like an actor reciting lines he'd rehearsed 100 times. Your Honor, this land holds tremendous potential for the economic development of this town. A resort will create jobs, draw in tourists, and increase property values in the area. The bank is merely fulfilling its duty in repossessing an asset tied to an unpaid loan. Mara clenched her fists tighter, fighting the urge to stand and shout. He was her own uncle, and here he was, trying to take the only home she had left. When it was Alex's turn, he stood, his posture steady, but his eyes full of resolve. He stepped up to the bench with the folder of documents they had found in her mother's boxes. His voice rang out, clear and firm, drawing a hush over the room. Your Honor, I am Alexander Reed, senior attorney at Harrison and Reed, representing the bank in this matter, he began, and Mara felt a sharp pain in her chest, hearing him acknowledge that role again. But then he continued, his voice low but unwavering. However, today I am not here in that capacity, but as a witness to irregularities in how this contract has been handled. A murmur rippled through the room. Edward Langley's brows knit together, his gaze turning hard as knives. Alex ignored him and pressed on. We have discovered the will of Mrs. Anna Langley, leaving the cabin explicitly to her daughter. This will was never notarized, but the signature has been verified by an independent expert. More importantly, I have evidence that Mr. Edward Langley, Miss Mara's uncle, intentionally manipulated documents to expedite foreclosure proceedings for his own gain in developing the land into a resort. Mara stared at Alex in disbelief. What was he doing? Exposing his own firm's client? She knew he had promised to help, but she hadn't expected him to go this far to stand directly against Edward and risk destroying his career. She looked at him, saw the tension in his face, but also the fierce determination, like he was laying everything on the line. Alex handed the judge a thick stack of papers, including internal emails from the law firm he'd quietly gathered, proving Edward had applied pressure to bypass proper legal process. These documents show Mr. Langley deliberately concealed Mrs. Anna Langley's will and provided false information to the bank, he said, his voice steady. This behavior not only breaches professional ethics, but also constitutes potential legal fraud. Edward shot to his feet, his face bright red. What are you talking about, Reed? You are my lawyer. You would betray me for some penniless girl? He nearly shouted, his voice shaking with rage. The judge rapped her gavel sharply, calling for order. Alex remained calm, though Mara noticed his hand gripping the edge of the stand. I am not betraying anyone, Mr. Langley, he replied evenly. I am doing the right thing. If my firm is forced to pay penalties over this, I accept the consequences. Mara felt her heart hammering in her chest. He was risking everything, his career, his reputation. She wanted to say something, to stop him, but all she could do was sit there and watch the man who had once been her enemy stand up for her. After an hour of tense argument, the judge finally spoke. In light of this new evidence, the court will postpone any foreclosure action until Mrs. Anna Langley's will can be fully authenticated. Allegations of document fraud will be subject to further investigation. This session is adjourned." The gavel struck, and Mara felt the weight of the world lift from her shoulders. She burst into tears, not from sorrow, but from an overwhelming sense of relief. Hot tears slid down her cheeks, unstoppable. She covered her face, trying to hide them, but her shoulders shook with every sob. She had fought for so long, so alone, and now, though this was only a temporary reprieve, it was like a brilliant beam of light breaking through the dark. Alex turned back, walked over, and sat beside her. He didn't say anything. He simply laid a hand on her shoulder, a simple gesture, but one that carried so much. Mara lifted her head, looking at him through her tears. You didn't have to do this," she whispered, her voice ragged. "You could lose everything." Alex smiled a sad, sincere smile. "There are things more important than money, Mara. You and Noah, you reminded me of that." Mara didn't reply, but she took his hand and squeezed it gently. In that moment, in the cold courtroom, she felt a new connection between them, not just reluctant allies, but someone she could finally begin to trust. Even though the road ahead was still so uncertain, the soft light of early spring slipped through the branches, casting a gentle glow over the cabin, which now carried a new sense of purpose. The court had officially recognized Mara's mother's will, declaring the cabin legally hers and placing the responsibility on her to repay the bank loan. Meanwhile, the allegations of Edward Langley's fraud were under investigation. But what surprised Mara more than anything was that the crushing loan that had weighed on her for so long, was suddenly paid in full just days after the hearing. A letter from the bank informed her that an anonymous third party had covered the entire amount, with no other details. Mara read the letter over and over, suspicion heavy in her heart. She thought of Alex, of his wealth, of the pained look in his eyes in that courtroom. But she had no proof, and he never mentioned it. When she asked, he only smiled and said, "Maybe you have a guardian angel." Mara stood in front of the cabin, a broom in hand, her gaze drifting over the newly replaced boards, the clean window frames, and the small garden she had begun to clear. She had decided to turn the cabin into a shelter, a small haven for the homeless, a place for anyone in need of a roof over their head, just as she had once opened her door to Alex and Noah on that blizzard night. The idea had come to her on a sleepless night when she realized the cabin was not only her mother's legacy, but a symbol of the kindness her mother had always believed in. Mara wanted to carry that forward, to turn her pain into hope for others. Today was the first day she'd begun repairing the cabin. She wore an old sweater, her hair tied up, sweeping the porch when the sound of a familiar engine reached her ears. Alex's sleek black SUV pulled up to the gate, and Noah jumped out, running straight into her arms. "Miss Mara, I want to help," he called out, his eyes bright. Alex followed, carrying a toolbox, smiling a little awkwardly. "I thought you might need extra hands," he said, his voice gentle but tinged with uncertainty. "Noah insisted we come, and I wanted to help too." Mara looked at him. "All right," she replied softly, "but don't break anything, counselor." Noah giggled and tugged her hand inside while Alex shook his head, that sheepish smile lingering on his lips. They set to work. Mara and Noah painted the front door, while Alex patched the gaps in the wooden walls. The steady rhythm of hammering, Noah's laughter, and Mara's quiet instructions blended into a bright melody that filled the cabin. Mara watched Noah happily painting a lopsided flower on the door and felt a gentle warmth spreading in her chest. This was what she wanted, a place that wasn't just her home, but a refuge for others who needed one. When the sun began to set, they sat on the porch, sharing cookies and apple juice Mara had prepared. Noah nestled between them, crumbs on his lips, talking about his dream of becoming an explorer. Mara laughed, brushing the boy's hair back, then glanced at Alex. He was watching her, his gaze tender but searching, as though he wanted to say something, but hadn't yet found the words. "Mara," he finally spoke, when Noah ran inside to grab more cookies. "I've never told you this, but you didn't just save Noah that night. You saved me too." Mara frowned, caught off guard by his confession. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice low, curious. Alex took a slow breath, his eyes drifting over the garden, now cleared of debris. After Emily died, I was living like a machine. I worked, I earned money, I took care of Noah, but I wasn't really alive. I built this world out of wealth and reputation, but inside it was hollow. Then you showed up. You opened your door in the middle of a storm and treated my son as if he were your own. He paused, meeting her gaze. You reminded me that kindness and sincerity are what really matter. Mara felt her heart thud hard in her chest. His words, so raw and unguarded, took her by surprise. She wanted to argue, to hold on to the safe distance she'd kept, but his eyes filled with hurt and hope kept her from looking away. She thought of how he had risked his career to stand up to Edward Langley, of how he had quietly helped her even when she had no proof, and she realized that somewhere along this path, she had started to find herself again, not just as the girl fighting to keep a cabin, but as someone who could trust, who could hope, and who could live for something bigger. I don't know if I deserved to hear that, she whispered, her voice catching, but thank you, Alex, for being here, for helping me. I think I found my reason to keep going. Alex smiled, a warm, unguarded smile. You don't need to thank me. I'm the one who owes you. Noah came bounding back out, holding a giant cookie, breaking the moment between them. Miss Mara, Dad said we're going to make this house the best place ever, he declared, hopping in excitement. Mara laughed, hugging Noah to her. She glanced at Alex and saw him smiling too, his eyes filled with a peace she'd never seen before. In that moment, under the pale sunset, the cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was proof of her journey from pain and betrayal to hope and new purpose. Mara knew that no matter how painful the past had been, she had found herself again, and maybe, just maybe, an unexpected family was taking shape in this little house. You're watching Soul Stories, exclusive to our channel. If you're still with us, drop a comment we read and cherish them all. Subscribe to support more heartfelt, original stories. Thanks for being part of the Soul Stories family. The night of the opening of the shelter at the cabin was filled with light and laughter. Lanterns hung along the porch, glowing softly as snowflakes drifted down from the sky. The townspeople came, bringing homemade cookies, warm blankets, and stories of their own hard times. Mara stood in the middle of the room, now clean and neatly renovated, with folding beds and a little kitchen corner for the homeless. She smiled as she listened to their words of gratitude, though inside a wistful feeling tugged at her. The cabin, once nearly lost to her, had become a warm beacon for those who needed it most. When the last guest left, Mara stepped onto the porch, hugging herself against the cold. Snow fell lightly, covering the eaves in a soft white layer. She lifted her eyes to the glittering stars and felt an unfamiliar peace. Her journey from the blizzard night, through betrayal, to the courtroom victory had changed her. She was no longer the lonely girl clutching a firewood stick for protection. She had found purpose again, opened her heart, and now stood there feeling lighter than she ever had. In her coat pocket, her fingers brushed against an opened envelope, a letter from Edward Langley, her uncle, that had arrived a few days before. She'd read it dozens of times, and each time still left her conflicted. In it, he apologized for trying to seize the cabin to build his resort. He wrote that greed had clouded his judgment, that he regretted betraying his family, and he begged for her forgiveness. I was wrong, Mara, he'd written, the shaky handwriting heavy with guilt. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know I am sorry for what I did. Mara didn't know how to feel angry, hurt, or a little relieved. The letter didn't erase the pain, but it was a reminder that even those who stray can sometimes find the way to redemption. Footsteps sounded softly behind her. She turned to see Alex stepping out of the cabin, hands in his coat pockets, his gaze gentle and searching. Noah had fallen fast asleep in a corner, wrapped snugly in blankets after an excited day helping her. Alex stopped beside her, not too close, but close enough that she could feel his warmth. Beautiful night, isn't it? Alex said, his low voice drifting up to the stars. I never thought a place like this could feel so peaceful. Mara smiled, tilting her head slightly. It used to be everything I had, she answered quietly. Now it's part of something much bigger. I think my mother would be proud. And She paused, pulling the letter from her pocket, her voice unsteady. My uncle apologized. He wrote to say he regrets what he did. I don't know if I can forgive him, but at least he tried. Alex looked at her, empathy softening his features. Forgiveness is a long road, Mara, he said, but admitting he was wrong is a step. You don't have to decide now. She nodded and tucked the letter back into her pocket, feeling just a little lighter. Alex stepped closer and gently took her hand. His touch was warm, and Mara felt her heart thump faster. Mara, he began, his voice trembling slightly. There's something I've needed to say for a long time. Since the first night, when you opened your door to me and Noah, when you cared for my son in the middle of that storm, I knew I loved you. Mara froze, her breath catching. She looked into his eyes and saw sincerity and the fear of rejection mingled together. Part of her wanted to flee from the surge of feeling, but his hand held hers not forcefully, just steady. I didn't dare say it, Alex continued, his voice barely a whisper. Because I knew I'd hurt you, but every day with you, every moment seeing you fight, seeing you turn this cabin into something meaningful, I became certain that I can't let you go. Mara felt tears rising. She thought of her uncle's letter, her own journey, and the man before her, once her enemy, now someone she trusted. Alex, she whispered, her voice breaking. I felt something that night too, but I was so afraid I'd lose everything again. He smiled a sad, warm smile. Then, to her surprise, he knelt right there on the porch where she had first let him and Noah in. From his coat pocket, he took out a silver ring. Under the lantern light, she could see the words engraved inside. Thank you for opening your door. Mara, he said, voice unsteady but resolute. I won't promise to be perfect. I once lived in a world of money and status, but without you, it all means nothing. I promise my heart will always stay open to you and Noah. Always. Will you stay with me? Mara covered her mouth as tears spilled over. She looked at the ring, the porch, and Alex's eyes that had once belonged to a stranger, but now were her whole world. She nodded, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, I will. Alex slid the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms. Mara rested her head against his chest, feeling his heartbeat matching her own. Inside, the cabin glowed bright with the fire's warmth. Childish laughter rang from the dining table. Mara, Alex, and Noah gathered over a simple dinner: potato soup and toast, but the air was filled with something richer than any feast. Noah, his face dusted with crumbs, chattered about his adventure plans, making them both laugh. Mara brushed a hand over the scar on her wrist, a mark from the day she'd repaired the roof, and realized it no longer felt like a symbol of pain. It was proof of her courage, her journey from a lonely girl to a woman who had found love and purpose again. Noah looked up, his eyes bright. Mama Mara, Daddy Alex, he said, innocent and earnest. Ours is the happiest house in the whole world, right? Mara froze, tears welling at the word Mama. She looked at Alex and felt his hand squeeze hers under the table. She nodded, voice breaking. That's right, Noah. The happiest in the world. In Mara's eyes, through the flickering firelight, there was finally peace. She looked around the cabin, once a place of sorrow, now her home, Alex's home, Noah's home. Under the starlit sky, with snow drifting down, she knew that the door she'd opened that night hadn't just saved a child. It had saved her heart and created an unexpected family.